so much. I'll start my timer. So my talk is entitled Michael Paine, Lee Oswald, and the Forbes family. And actually, this is personal. My wife and I have been divorced for 25 years. We were married for 25 years. But my children are Forbeses, my grandchildren are Forbeses, and I'm doing this for two reasons. Someone murdered my president, and I think we ought to find out whom. And I want my children and my grandchildren to feel good about this and their connection to everything. So I'm doing that for these reasons. My overall theme is who watches the watchers? And my theory for the answer to that question, which is broader than the subject of my talk today, is they watch each other. I have a notion of how J. Walton Moore operated his Office of Domestic Services in Dallas and New Orleans, and that's a little summary of my theory right there. But we're going to talk about who's watching. This started when I saw Max Good's film, The Assassination of Mrs. Paine, 2 years ago. At that point, there was a revelation for me. I saw some pictures of Michael Paine. I didn't know who Michael Paine was, but I said, I've seen that man. Where have I seen that man? And looking, watching his thing, Googling, I realized, my God, I've seen him on the ferry to Nashan. Suddenly, I was pulled into the question of who killed my president. I knew where I was when President Kennedy's death was announced. I can also say that for the intervening years, I didn't really pay any attention to the questions surrounding it. For the last 2 years, I've been paying very intense attention to the questions surrounding it. I've read a lot of books. I know I'm in the company, I consider myself in the company of people who know everything, and I'm starting to figure some things out. But I do have a pile of 85 books in my study. I've done a fair amount of research online. I've talked to Ruth Paine. I've talked to Ernst Titovitz. I've received extraordinary help from Max Good, Bill Simpich, and Nancy Wyford, all of whom gave me support, encouragement, and information. Actually, Nancy's reviewed an early version of this talk. So, given my personal connection, my thought has been to try to answer the following question. Why was Michael Paine hanging out with Lee Oswald in 1963? And is there something that, now I didn't know Michael Paine. I've seen him, but I did not personally know him. I've had tea with his mother, I've had tea with his stepfather, and I've been very embedded in the Forbes family, but I didn't know Michael Paine. But does my intimate knowledge of the Forbes family in some way or another help answer this question? And if that question is answered, does that tell us something about who Lee Oswald was, at least from the perspective of my personal experience of the family that Michael Paine came from? I might run over, I might get cut off, and I want you to know what I think. So here's the thesis. Michael Paine was a security risk because of his job and because of his family. I'm going to tell you some things about his family that you don't know. Lee Oswald was doing what he did all of 1962 and 1963. Here's my take on who Lee Oswald was. He was trolling for commies. He not, in my humble opinion, a leftist himself. That was all a provocateur act to out communists, and that's exactly what he was doing, say, with Bannister, who did that all the time. And what was Michael Paine doing with, what was Lee Oswald doing with Michael Paine? He was checking him out as a security risk. The Forbes family. There's actually a, well, there's a Forbes clan in Scotland. In America, there are any number of branches, descendants of the Forbes family. The family that I am talking about is defined by its collective ownership of a 7-mile island off of Woods Hole, Massachusetts, that is named Nausham. That's a Native American name. Native American place names are preponderant in the area. I live in Hocasset, which is right up there. That's another Native American place name. But we're talking about a family which is descended from this man, John Murray Forbes, who in the middle of the 19th century was one of the richest men in America. He built 2 fortunes. First of all, trading with China. The China trade, opium, tea, I'm not sure exactly what, definitely included opium, and, but he was part of the New England merchant trading class, and a very successful person doing that. He came back to America, it's 1850, and he invested in railroads. He was very successful doing that. He was a man of significant, wealth and status that when the Civil War broke out, he wrote a letter, Mr. President, you have a war starting, you're going to need a navy, we're sending you half a dozen of our ships. His enduring legacy comes from the fact that he bought Nausham Island and left it to his descendants. So this family defines itself as the descendants of John Murray Forbes. Along the way were his son, William Hathaway Forbes. Well, he was a rich man's kid. He got himself expelled from Harvard. He went off to the Army. He was a cavalry officer. He had disposable capital. He funded Alexander Graham Bell in his early days. And he married a daughter of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Emerson Forbes, his son, was sort of the next generation of wealth. He married someone in another famous Boston Brahmin family, Elise Cabot. He was an attorney. He was a model for the late George Apley. And I mention this because the late George Apley, John Marquand, was a satire of what the Boston Brahmin class had become, dull and predictable. Perhaps keying on that, and I didn't know him, I can't categorize him, but keying on that, I can say that his children, now William Hathaway Forbes was my father-in-law. I can say that William Hathaway Forbes, Ruth Forbes, Margaret Forbes, and Pauline Forbes decided not to be dull and predictable. So, for instance, William Hathaway Forbes did the predictable thing of going to Harvard. He got out of Harvard. His father said, do you want to go to the business school or the law school? He said, I'm going to Beirut. He taught at the American University in Beirut. I'm not sure exactly of the steps. He then went to Cambridge University here as the place where he could find leadership in the biological sciences. He went back to Harvard as a tutor, and now, so around 1930. He's 28 years old. He's single. The family likes to think of him as the most eligible bachelor in Boston. And he formed a relationship not with Amy Lowell, as his mother wanted him to do, but with a divorced Swedish socialist, Eleanor Andrea Andrén. Eleanor Andrea Andrén was a physician, a significant promoter of the rights of professional women. Was extremely interested in the Soviet experiment as it was developing in Russia. And I'm jumping ahead here. In 1953, well, in 1940 they split up. She went back to Sweden. She did some things that I'm going to get into. In 1953, she won the Stalin Peace Prize. There is a kind of parallel to the Oppenheimer story. Oppenheimer in the 1930s had a girlfriend, Jean Tatlock, who was a communist, and who by 1953, the whole question of Oppenheimer's sort of loyalty situation to the United States depended on essentially the history of his relationship with Jean Tatlock. My father-in-law had a relationship with someone of a similar profile. And I'm talking from the perspective now of James Angleton. Not, it's a sort of funny set of mirrors here that we're doing. But I jumped ahead of myself because I want to talk about who these children were. We have William Hathaway Forbes. We have Ruth Forbes, who was the mother of Michael Paine. And we have Pauline Forbes. So I'm going to talk mainly about my father-in-law, William Hathaway Forbes, and this relationship with Andrea Andrén, and what I think that means for the way in which the family could be perceived as posing a security risk. But I want to check in here with Michael Paine. It is already well known that Michael Paine's father was a communist. His mother, Ruth Forbes, married Lyman Paine. They divorced when Michael was about 7 or 8 or something like that. Nancy Whiteford has spoken to you about this history. And by the time Michael... Did I just speak for half an hour? We got to go. Okay. So you know Michael Paine was a security risk. Sorry. Eleanor Andrea Andrén was an officer of the Women's International Democratic Foundation, member of the World Peace Council, both of which are Communist Front, were deemed Communist Front organizations, and in 1952 participated in the Needham Commission. The Needham Commission was an investigation into charges that the United States had waged biological warfare in North Korea. They interviewed captured American airmen. They concluded that the U.S. had waged biological warfare in North Korea, and she was targeted by Swedish intelligence for the rest of her life. I suggest that James Angleton was surely reading her correspondence with William Forbes to reconnect. They broke up around 1940. He married my mother-in-law, Ann Pappenheimer. She went back to Sweden. She then did her thing and went on the Needham Commission. But for the rest of their lives, they corresponded. I've read their correspondence. I went to Gothenburg, Sweden, and found the letters and read their correspondence. So from wherever it started, I've seen correspondence from 1950 to 1958. They were regularly writing letters back and forth. I have not found documentary evidence that James Angleton was reading their correspondence, but there is evidence that James Angleton was definitely reading her correspondence, because another one of her correspondents was Ava Pauling, wife of Linus Pauling, and here's a letter saying, let's, maybe the next disarmament conference should be held in the United States if possible, but it might be easier for left-wing women from Western Europe to enter Canada. Thank you, Ava. I think your plan for Oslo is splendid, and if we can't do that, we'll meet in Sweden or Norway. James Angleton. Linus Pauling was on H.T. Lingvall's list. James Angleton was definitely reading her mail to the Paulings. So I'm saying that to the profile of Michael Paine as a security risk because his father was a communist, we can add that he was a security risk because his mother's brother was writing to a communist continuously. Down the next one, Pauline Forbes married Alvin Pappenheimer. Well, in 1943, Alvin Pappenheimer was at Camp Dietrich, and here's what he did. In June 1943, a crew of 4 scientists, all of them PhDs in either chemistry or bacteriology, assembled in Black Maria, the shed where the vats were, and began to work. They were Alvin Pappenheimer, John Schwab, Mike Foster, and Bill Durrell. Pappenheimer, leader of the group, was a Harvard University toxicologist and a world expert in Clostridium botulinum, the botulinum microbe. He was, in fact, the first person ever to be immunized against the toxin. So what we have here is the origins of biological warfare in America. And the first production batch of botulinum toxin to come out of Fort Detrick. And Michael Paine's uncle-in-law was involved, had been involved, this was 20 years before, of course, in that production. And on top of that, we have a little bunch of potential connections that I want to investigate. Paul Fildis is UK. The request came from England to Fort Detrick in the 1940s saying, we've been able to make the botulinum toxin in milk bottle batches. We need vat batches. Can you do that? Ira Baldwin came from the University of Wisconsin to set up the team at Fort Detrick that took that on and assigned the task to Alvin Pappenheimer, whom you've just read, put together the team that produced that. Well, there were some interesting people that he was connected to. You just read that John Schwab was on the team doing the botulinum toxin, and John Schwab became the head of the director, the Department of Special Projects. I'm sorry, that's a generic term, but I don't. Special Operations Division of Fort Detrick. So Alvin Pappenheimer had been intimately connected to the person who went ahead to develop special operations at Fort Detrick. Ira Baldwin came from the University of Wisconsin. Alvin Pappenheimer came from the University of Wisconsin. And I don't know if you recognize this name, Frank Olson came from the University of Wisconsin. Anybody know who Frank Olson is? Do you know the LSD experiments and the unwitting victims and the person who drove out of the
window?
The window, that's Frank Olson. Now, Pappenheimer, Schwab was in fact another ingester of that unwitting LSD. John Schwab was at that LSD party that led to Frank Olson's undoing. Alan Pappenheimer was no longer at Fort Detrick. He was had then went on to NYU and Harvard. We're talking now 1953. But Alan Pappenheimer was intimately involved with John Schwab and conceivably Frank Olson. It basically sorry. I have asked Alan Pappenheimer's daughter, did you ever hear the name Sidney Gottlieb? Yeah. And I didn't get anywhere with that. But I have heard some, I mean, she's been an extraordinary source for me. And she has told me the story of the day that her father came home from the laboratory with a raging fever. Family was, you know, I don't know, raging fever, significant challenge. And he's telling his wife, you can't call the doctor, this is secret. And the problem was that he had created an antidote to the botulinum toxin. He had injected it on himself, and unfortunately he turned out to be allergic to the bovine serum that was the carrier. So, what we have here then is for the people of Michael Paine's mother's generation, we have three security risks. The known one of his mother married a communist. The second one of his uncle was corresponding with a communist. The third one being his uncle-in-law was a leader was one of the world's experts in botulinum, in biological warfare, botulinum toxin. And by the way, when Sidney Gottlieb went to the Congo on a mission to poison Lumumba, what did he take? A dose of botulinum toxin. So that's another question that I have. Now, I have to tell you, I used to go to Harvard hockey games with Alan Pappenheimer. I've lived in his house. I'm talking about people that I'm, very personally connected to, and I'm very interested in understanding what was their role. At a minimum, though, whatever they did or didn't do, if I were to flip it around, I would almost say James Angleton must have been watching them. I mean, I'd even say, as a taxpayer, I would feel like, wait a second, how could he not be watching them? That was his job. So, this next slide gets us into a little bit of speculation. I'm going to skip one. This is my mental notion of Forbes family connections with intelligence. You know how if you keep brushing into people and then you find, someone else comes to dinner or someone else shows up at the country club and they're all CIA, you might start to worry or wonder. Well, here's the list that I've come up with so far. So, William Forbes' correspondent with Andrea Andreen was a probable target of MK Ultra. Ruth Forbes' friendship with Mary Bancroft, mistress of Alan Dulles, which is David Talbot pointed that out. Alan Pappenheimer involvement in Biowarfare Center in Fort Detrick. I just skipped Jeffries Wyman, who was a Cabot cousin. I knew Jeffries' daughter. I've met Jeffries Wyman. Jeffries Wyman was friends with Oppenheimer, and he got quizzed by the FBI in 1953 because Oppenheimer had come to him, and he was at that time science attaché in Paris. Oppenheimer had come to him and said, can you get, my friend Hakon Chevalier is having troubles with his US passport. Can you fix that for him, please? And the FBI came and said, what the hell was that all about? Yeah. And so he got tangled up in intelligence matters. I've discovered that the next house over on the Sean was so going up to this Mary Bancroft, Alan Dulles relationship, a good buddy of Mary Bancroft's was one Amy Colt, whose husband was Chis Colt. I've read a letter from Mary Bancroft to Alan Dulles saying, we had a great time. Clover, Alan, and I had a great dinner over at Chis and Mary Colt's the other night. This was around 1950. Well, Chis and Mary Colt rented the next house over on the Sean from my father-in-law. My wife's senior thesis advisor at Harvard was Ned Keenan. John Newman describes the scene of Lee Oswald walking into the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, with his passport for what I deem to be a fake defection. Half of John Newman's account comes from Ned Keenan, who was sitting in the room watching this happen. He was at that point a graduate student. He was later expelled, or I'm sorry, I'm not sure whether he was expelled, I don't know whether he was there, but he was declared persona non grata by the Soviet Union on suspicion of being a spotter for the CIA. And I think his presence at Lee's defection underscores the probability that it was a fake defection. And my informant, one of the daughters of Alan Pappenheimer, had, as her roommate at Radcliffe, a young woman whose father was CIA. And her uncle, my father-in-law, was extremely upset every time that man's name was mentioned. So there's a level at which the explanation is, well, they all knew each other, and there's another level of explanation which was they were all watching each other. That's the theme I set out at the beginning. My in-laws were one way or another entangled with the Central Intelligence Agency, and I think that that explains why Lee Oswald was in one of their homes. Here's who I think Lee Oswald was. I think he was a troll. I take as my understanding of Lee Oswald Robert Oswald's recollection of his brother's obsession with the story of Herbert Philbrick, I Led 3 Lives. I didn't discover that connection, but I read into it and say, here's the young Lee. He's forming a kind of attachment to a hero, and what does this hero do? He goes undercover to join communist cells on behalf of the FBI to later testify against them when they go on trial for violating whatever You Can't Be a Communist Act the United States had implemented. But Lee's hero was someone who went undercover to ferret out communists. I see that as determinative. Or to put it another way, if you take the episodes in Lee's life, which are paradoxes, mysteries, and whatever, if you kind of try to draw a straight line from that base of who was Herbert Philbrick and what did he admire about Herbert Philbrick, and go, it's a pretty straight line. So here are the other episodes. Sorry, bad with names. Who here earlier telling us that Civil Air Patrol was a breeding ground for undercover agents. I totally buy into that Lee knew David Ferrie. I think Lee was very influenced by David Ferrie, and I buy into the notion that sort of his first boost on the persona that evolved for the next 10 years was pushed along by David Ferrie. In the Marines, I've looked at the Queen Bee Lounge incident. It's extremely easy to imagine Lee hanging out in an officers' club, in an officers' sex and pleasure club to see who was spilling the beans about where the nukes were at Sugi. That's a totally plausible explanation of how he was hanging out in a club above his pay grade.
Way above,
Huh?
it's way above.
Way above.
So,
Totally above.
So expensive.
Totally above. You know, he probably didn't even have enough money to tip the bartender just to get to stay there. And then a girlfriend, totally in the package, totally an intelligence package. But he, as an agent, not as a target. So, fake defector, DeMorenschildt, this is sheer speculation, but there's a little incident where DeMorenschildt goes to J. Walton Moore and says, have you guys been photographing my report on the trip down to Central America? And DeMorenschildt says, well, if it was us, you know, you wouldn't know it. But I sort of wonder whether Lee wasn't practicing some moves on his handler. But that's just speculation. You know, there's a quality to the Russian expatriate community. Again, I'm just jumping. I think they were all spying on each other. And I think within Lee's, as far as Lee's concerned, George Bouvet complained that every time he went over to that guy's house, he had daily worker lying around. Well, I think it was provocation. At Jaggers Child's Stovall, his supervisor to the Warren Commission complained, you know, he would, you remember that he went there essentially the day that they got highly classified Army security work as the Cuban Missile Crisis developed. Suddenly, Lee's there as a trainee graphics layout person. And he's there for a few months. Crisis subsides. Suddenly Lee can't reconcile his compositions. They're all 1/8 inch off to the left or something or other. And he's deemed not an adequate trainee and he's let go. And in the testimony of the Warren Commission, the supervisor says, he was always sitting around reading this Daily Worker. Well, Jaggers Childs had actually had a security incident some years before that. And I have to imagine that I have to believe it's totally plausible that what he was doing in that newspaper was essentially seeing whether anybody said, oh, I read that. And with Michael Paine, the first thing when Michael went over to pick up Lee and Marina to come over to the Paines for dinner as part of their, I'm skipping the Magnolia party, but Ruth has made her overtures to Marina. They're invited over to dinner. They want to. The first thing that Michael goes to pick them up, and the first thing that Lee does is show him this picture. Now, given, you know, it has been noted, I keep forgetting what the titles of those two newspapers are, but I understand that they're from the Communist Party branch and the Trotskyite Party branch. it's almost like Lee's there saying, which one do you like? And then I'll put that in my report. Well, Michael lied about that to the Warren Commission. He said when he went over to pick up Lee, there was something about his graphics work and layout for the Sunday newspaper or something. And only in the 1990s did Michael say in an interview that, oh yeah, I saw that picture. Well, I think Lee was being his provocative self, and it's a clue that what he was up to was checking out Michael Paine. I've kind of developed all of this on my own track, and then I was kind of pleased to see Peter Dale Scott saying, was Oswald an industrial security informant? And I won't read that line of argument, but he's looking at Lee Oswald in very much the same way. So where I come out is, so we've done the Forbes family, we've done Lee Oswald, we've talked about Michael Paine along the way. Where I come out is the Forbeses were being watched, Michael Forbes Paine was being watched, and Lee Oswald was watching. Conclusion, what brought Michael Paine and Lee Oswald together? Not Ruth Paine's cover story that Rena needed health care for her second child, which indeed she did, and we can get into a whole question of how that worked out in the course of 1963. But that Michael was a security risk and Lee was a security agent troll. So that's where I've been. First four I went through earlier, and here's my conclusion. That Michael Paine's family was a security risk, Lee Oswald was a security troll. This doesn't exclude at all the possibility that the Paines are minding Lee. But I conclude that Lee was checking out Michael. And way beyond today's discussion, that's why I put that thing at the beginning. Who watches the watchers? They're watching each other. I've looked at J. Walton Moore. His job was to know everything about everybody of security interest in his area. And I think this is one of the ways to do it. And that's it. Questions?
So, Robert, are you saying that Lee Harvey Oswald was employed by the CIA? He was a...
Well, that's what's so cool about the Peter Dale Scott thing. There's all kinds of levels to how you can be part of the intelligence apparatus. So I think he was off the books, one way or the other. So no, I don't think he was a CIA agent. I think...
Who was he reporting to? Who did he provide the information about who he was keeping an eye on? Where was that data being sent?
I don't know.
Well, he was seen with David Atlee Phillips.
It was seen with, although, maybe. Right. Right, I sat next to, at the WEC conference last November, I sat next to John Newman and his research assistant, and that's actually, I heard no. So I don't know about that particular account of Vetsianis, but I mean, I do know that it's, so I have to imagine that, well, there were different jobs. I think for the fair play that the whole fair play for Cuba committee thing was a provocation.
Sure.
And I imagine, so in my imagination, somebody named Maurice was handling it. We can all argue about who Maurice is. Yeah, yeah.
Vessiano confirmed that Attlee and Bishop were the same person.
I know.
It took him a long
I don't
time to
believe
actually-
everything.
Actually, really confirm.
I don't believe anything anyone says in this honestly.
Fair
And
enough.
so that's why I said, let me see if I can draw a straight line. Actually, I mentioned yesterday that I have training as a historian of the Middle Ages. I know when I read a history of the Middle Ages, or some history, original document, that the person writing that document has an axe to grind. So I do believe I've been trained by some great historians in how to sort of read text skeptically and sensitively. So any given thing, I just don't know whether I should believe it or not, but I'm trying to figure out what fits together.
Thanks a lot. Just thinking of the final point there about is it possible that the Paines were minding Lee and Lee was checking out Michael, because most of the evidence, or a lot of the evidence that was presented against Oswald all emanated from the Paine garage, a lot of it. So I wonder what you think about if indeed Lee was checking out Michael Paine, would the Paines have been aware of that, and were they actually trying to draw him, almost trying to kind of like, I don't know, like outfox him in a way, because he, that's where a lot of the evidence came, was from the Paine garage, and I'm just wondering whether they kind of manipulated him when we thought he was actually manipulating them. I don't know if that makes sense, does it?
Well, if he showed that to picture to Michael Paine, then he was in the business of planting at least some of that evidence with Paine himself. So I'm actually headed in the direction of, was Lee involved in some mega plot run by Maurice, which is not the assassination of the president, but there are a million ways that the assassination of the president and the assassination of Cuba, Castro, have been kind of conflated, compounded, twisted around. So in thinking about, I've asked myself the question, when we got up in the morning of November 22nd of the Paines, what the hell was he thinking?
Yeah, I mean, Michael Paine actually, I think it might have been that time, that the first time I think Michael Paine met Lee Oswald was when he went and picked him up.
Yeah.
Or the Oswald's up for dinner. And he told the Warren Commission that was April the 10th, 1963, which was the same day of the Walker shooting. Now, the Warren Commission questioners didn't really pick up on that. Well, if that dinner happened on April the 10th, then Oswald couldn't have been out shooting at General Walker. And
Right.
Eventually, the penny dropped, and they said, "Oh, wait a minute, we've got to kind of address that." And basically, they just said that he was mistaken, and the Ruth Paine dated it something like the 2nd or the 3rd of April, based on a calendar that she
I
used.
see. I wasn't aware that he'd originally put it on the same
I
day.
mean, he may have just been mistaken in the date, but it's interesting that he used that date. But they've got to get that evidence into the Paine garage to implicate Oswald in the assassination. That's just what I'm interested in.
Well, I personally think he had the rifle, and I think he had the picture. And I mean, so from my point of view, I'm not too worried about that being a fake picture. I think it was a real picture, and that he was using it as part of his provocation.
I mean, I certainly agree with you that Oswald was a fake defector. I think that an agent provocateur, as opposed to what we heard yesterday about Oswald being a genuine Marxist and a genuine defector. I just don't think that's credible.
Which?
The fact that he's a genuine Marxist.
No, I know.
I agree with
Yeah, so in a sense, I don't have any problem with him having a neon camera in the garage. Or leaving some FBCC posters or whatever. I've sort of consciously focused on Michael Paine, partly because, I found some of these Forbes family connections and I've just pursued them. I have talked with Ruth Paine, but at that time I didn't know very much. Well, I'm not saying I could do any better talking to Ruth Paine, but
How long ago was it you spoke to?
if I've been at this 2 years, it was about a year ago,
Really?
maybe a year and a half.
She said when we were at the talk, and then there she says she doesn't like to speak to people that think it was a conspiracy.
Yeah, I actually did put so I think she was willing to talk to me because of my family connection. But I put my cards on the table. I said, I don't agree with you. So she said, oh, I respect that. So, and I have written her to say, I figured out this connection of my father-in-law, Andrew Ann Green, and her activities, which clearly brought her under the scrutiny of the CIA. And I think that there's something going on here. In fact, so she knows that I think this theory, and she wrote back saying, no way. But, if I ever wrote Ruth Paine another letter, I would say, wait a second. And this would be on my liner. We're all watching each other. Every time you wrote a letter to your mother or to your sister, you were providing information about what Lee and Marina were doing that month or whatever. So, at a minimum, she was obviously a conduit of information about what's happening with the Oswalds, because her sister, again, almost as a taxpayer, I say, wait a second, if her sister wasn't filing the report on that, she wasn't doing her job. So I would love to have, at a minimum, that conversation with Ruth. You were part of an information flow of the intelligence agency. Come on, let's talk about that. Yeah.
Although we seen her last November, didn't we?
We did.
And what should we have done? We should have stood up and walked out. We should have stood up and walked out.
Well, we decided not to stand up and walk out because it would be disrespectful, but it was the least value for money, $65 that we spent on that trip.
I've written
Just rubbish.
I've written to her daughter and not gotten any answer. I actually had a very unfortunate for that completely unplanned phone conversation with his son, and we sort of both puffed each other. It wasn't a good interview.
Yeah, our son was there in November. He was sitting behind me, and he was a tall guy.
Well, where do you think you go next with this? Where have you got in mind where you take it on?
Actually, if anyone here is an expert in freedom of information requests, I need to start diving into that. And over in the States, I need to find somebody who, I know that I can go on a website and find the ways to get advice on the ways to do it, but I'd like to talk to someone, but I'm also well aware that they're going to stall. And I'd like to talk to someone who understands the strategies for crafting the report. Sorry?
Bill Simpich, perhaps?
What?
Bill Simpich?
Oh yeah, I know Bill.
Well, he could help. He's a lawyer, I think.
I know.
Human rights lawyer or whatever, so.
Right. Well, I've asked him about that. I didn't get an answer yet. but yes, I know Bill. He's been great.
Yeah.
And he has so many, I think it's time to ask him again, because,
That's definitely if you want to go down that road, yeah.
Okay, is there any other questions? All right, that's great, Robert. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
named there, and I call it the White Gloves Legend. And it's about my journey of investigation.
Yeah.
And I'll be writing about this, copy to you.
Great.
Thank you very much. I mean, this has been